Welcome to Faith in Extraordinary Times. My name's Dave. I'm the head of campaigns at CSW. Here comes the fancy TV graphic. There we go. And my guest today is Mervyn Thoms CMG. He's the CEO and founder of CSW. Welcome, Merv.
Hi, Dave.
Mervyn was awarded the Companion of Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George at their New Year's Honours, which is in recognition of his work in human rights and freedom of religion or belief. Merv's also on the Human Rights Advisory Group for the Foreign Secretary. Is that a good enough intro for you, Merv?
Yeah, I think it's a bit over the top, but there you go. That's I'm just Merv Thoms, father, husband, boss.
So, on that great note, Merv, perhaps you could start by telling us how CSW came to be.
So we're looking at 41 years now to 1979. And I was doing some work as a very young man, of course, back then. I was doing some work in Parliament, a couple of evenings a week for a Christian MP, and we heard about Christians being persecuted in Eastern Europe, the old Soviet bloc, and so we felt that we should set up an organisation here called Christian Solidarity, and to be a voice, not to be anything else, but to be a voice. Proverbs 31 tells us that we're to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves, and that's what we felt our role was. And so that's how we started speaking up for Christians in Eastern Europe.
And maybe you could tell us how actually religious freedom has changed then since that, since 40 years.
Yeah, well, of course, it's changed a lot. As 10 years after that, in 1989 and 1990, communism began to fall all over Europe, and suddenly, almost overnight, those Christians that were imprisoned and were oppressed were suddenly free, and so we actually had to look and wonder whether there was still a role for CSW, because actually in those days there wasn't a lot of information about persecution anywhere else in the world. And so in fact, I remember some supporters writing and saying clearly there's no need for CSW anymore, but of course there was, and we looked around and we saw many other countries where there was Christian persecution, but we had to start from square one, which was, actually finding out, getting contacts in these countries. Where is it bad? Where is it very bad? Which we did. And but then probably about 10 years after that, we, during our work in Burma, as we were investigating religious freedom abuses in Burma, we came across the group called the Rohingya Muslims, which of course most people today have heard of, but they were not known in those days. They were badly persecuted by the regime in Myanmar, and we had to kind of make a decision. We've been set up to speak up for Christians persecuted, and do we speak up for people of other faiths too? And that may seem a bit of a no-brainer. But actually 20 years ago, that was quite a bold decision to make, was to for a Christian group to speak out for other faith groups. So of course we did decide to speak out for other faith groups, because Proverbs 31, which I quoted just now, says speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. It doesn't say speak up for Christians who are unable to speak for themselves, or God's covenant people. It says speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. And of course, the great story that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan is all about standing up, speaking out for those and acting on behalf of those that are different from us. What it doesn't mean, and this is something that we really had to explain carefully to our supporters, what it doesn't mean is that somehow overnight CSW became a syncretist organisation that believed that all roads led to God. I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father, and but as Christians, we are duty bound to speak out against injustice, even if we disagree with what the others believe or what they say. God is a God of justice. God gave us all a free will, and so people are free to choose. And so what we do in speaking up for people of all faiths is that we do that out of our Christian motivation. But of course, you've got to remember that still the vast majority of persecution of people of faith around the world is against Christians.
So here we are in lockdown, week, I don't know what it is, 5 or something. What we're going through is really not too much of a hardship, but how has the coronavirus affected the situation for religious minorities around the world?
Well, it's a good question because, of course, as you quite rightly point out, it is affecting everybody in the world, some countries worse than others. And what we experience of being shut up in our homes and of not having much freedom is something that is experienced around the world by Christians and people of other minorities very often on a regular basis. But the question was, how is the current situation affecting persecution? And in fact, it's having an adverse effect on persecution because this pandemic is allowing governments to put in place emergency legislation that will restrict people going out. It will restrict people coming together. So one of the big things is, of course, churches are closed all around the world, and we would support that in the name of life, in stopping people dying from this disease. But what we need to be very careful about is that these measures are time bound, so that as soon as it's possible, that churches and mosques and synagogues will be reopened around the world, and that's something that we must keep a very close eye on, because we are certain that some governments will use that as an excuse to keep them closed. We feel that in many places governments are using COVID-19 as an excuse to and as a way of stepping up persecution, and with the thought that governments and NGOs like CSW won't notice what's going on because of all of the other issues that are surrounding it. And in fact, in some places, in India, for example, Muslims are being accused by the Hindu majority of being carriers of the virus. And in fact, in other countries, Christians too have been accused of being carriers of the virus. So it's a time that religious minorities are being stigmatized. And also, the last way in which this can affect Christians and religious minorities is that some of these restrictions that are put on, such as closing places of worship, but also restrictions on going outside, etc. Some of them, if we're not careful, will only be applied to certain groups of people. And so will be a restriction for religious minorities like Christians.
All right. Well, our work can get pretty heavy at times. So maybe could you share a story, something that's encouraged you recently in your work?
At CSW, the stories are heartbreaking, they're harrowing, they're vicious and nasty. So how do you cope? And that's a question that I'm asked all the time. And I always answer in the same way, that I cope because it enables me to meet the most amazing people, most amazing Christians and people of incredible faith. People like Leah Sharibu. Leah, as most listeners probably know, was a schoolgirl captured together with her classmates, 100 of them, 110 of them were captured just over 2 years ago. And Leah was held because she was a Christian. The others were all Muslims, but she was told she could go free with her friends if she converted to Islam first. And unbelievably, a girl at the time who was 14 said no. She refused to convert. And so people like Leah and seeing the incredible faith of people like her, seeing the faith of people like Helen Bahani, who you had on a few weeks ago in Eritrea, spending 3 years in a metal shipping container. People like Miriam Ibrahim, having to give birth in a squalid prison cell, all because of their faith. It's meeting those and having the privilege to speaking out for those that really not just keeps me going, but inspires me in my own personal Christian life.
Like a true professional, Merv, that leads us nicely onto inviting those of you watching to join us in prayer for Leah on the 14th of May, which is actually Leah's 17th birthday, and we want to mark that day in prayer. And you can find out more on the website. We're having an online prayer meeting, resources for you to pray in your home or with your church. So look those up. A last question, Merv. What have you learned about faith in difficult times through your work?
In all of the years that I've been doing this, I can't remember meeting a miserable persecuted Christian. I've met a few miserable Christians, but not those that are persecuted in some of the most dire situations and difficult countries. These people have something, an inner joy. In fact, I took my son, who was 17 at the time, to Nigeria, and we went. Well, you were with us, Dave. We went to that village Asso in northern Nigeria, and you remember it was a dreadful place to go. These were villagers that had been killed, that were being continuing to be killed by the Fulani on a regular basis, and they were beginning to starve because they couldn't farm their land because the Fulani were hiding in their land and taking over their land. And I remember feeling quite helpless when we were meeting them in their, you remember, their village hall, and I prayed with them. And I remember as we came out of the village, my son said to me, Daddy said it should be compulsory for every British Christian to come to this village. And I said, but why? He said, because even though they're dying and they have nothing and they've got so much to complain about, he said, I could just sense an inner joy in their hearts. And he said, we don't always find that in our churches. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think if there's one thing that I've learned, is to try and get this joy at all times, even in the most distressing circumstances. And my goodness, we find the stupidest things to complain about, don't we? But just to give thanks in all things. And I don't know whether Helen said this on her story the other week, but she talked about how when she was in prison, what did she do? She sang praises in the same way that Paul and Silas did. And I think it's those things. And the other lesson that I would learn about, that I have learned about persecution is, and this also touches Helen, because the first time I ever met Helen, just after she came out of prison, I spent an hour with her, and she, all of her conversation, most of her conversation was literally her quoting the scriptures. And she had the word of God in her heart, she had it in her DNA. And when people say to me, how should I prepare for persecution? I always say, learn the word of God, get the word of God inside you. It gives you strength at times like that. She was able to draw on those scriptures when she was in difficult times. So that's two things I've learned: to give thanks and to learn the word of God.
Well, thanks, Merv. That's a great note to end on, as inspiring as ever. And yeah, you can actually, speaking of inspiring, get Merv's book, which is Standing Up and Speaking Out, available in all good bookshops. All right. Thanks, Merv.
Thanks, Dave.